What if the headline that sounded like an ending was really the start of something far more dangerous? On February 22, 2026, Mexican authorities announced that Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, the longtime leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, had been killed during a military operation near Tapalpa, Jalisco. For years, his name had been treated as one of the most feared in organized crime, attached to a cartel that expanded across Mexico and deep into international drug trafficking networks. A man pursued by Mexican authorities, sanctioned by the United States, and listed with a reward that reached up to $15 million, was suddenly gone. But the moment that news broke, the region did not breathe easier. Roads were blocked. Vehicles were burned. Panic moved faster than official statements. And for a country that had spent years hearing that this man was untouchable, the shock was not only that he had finally been found. The shock was what happened immediately after. Before we go further, like this video, subscribe to True Crime Dre, and let me know where you are watching from, because this story begins with one of the biggest cartel developments Mexico has seen in years, and the consequences are still unfolding. The first thing that makes this case so compelling is the contradiction at its center. On paper, this was supposed to look like a major state victory. The leader of CJNG, widely described as one of the most powerful drug traffickers in the world, had been neutralized in a military operation. Yet, almost immediately, the aftermath suggested that the structure under him was still capable of hitting back with speed, coordination, and force. AP reported sweeping disruptions after his death. Reuters reported retaliatory unrest, road blockades, and arson in the wake of the raid. This is where the real story begins, because the question is not only how one of the most wanted men in the hemisphere died. The deeper question is how someone who had survived more than a decade of military pressure, intelligence efforts, sanctions, indictments, and public reward offers was finally located at all. Men like this do not usually vanish because of one sudden breakthrough. They vanish because years of pressure narrow every option until one small vulnerability becomes fatal. In this case, that vulnerability appears to have been human. According to reporting from Reuters and AP, the trail that led Mexican forces to El Mencho did not begin with a dramatic chase or a random discovery. It began with surveillance tied to one of his romantic partners and then moved outward through a trusted associate connected to that circle. That detail matters more than it may seem at first. In organized crime, people often imagine that the decisive break comes through weapons, technology, or some spectacular undercover maneuver. But many of the biggest captures and takedowns come from something slower and more difficult to control. Personal relationships. Financial networks can be hidden. Communications can be compartmentalized. Rural properties can be rotated. Bodyguards can be layered around a target. But people still form attachments, still rely on trusted intermediaries, still create patterns. And over time, patterns become roots, roots become locations, and locations become operations. If the reporting is correct, then the most elusive part of El Mencho's world was not broken by a public shootout first. It was broken by proximity, by contact, by the fact that even the most disciplined criminal structure is still made of human beings who leave traces behind them. To understand why his death became such a major event, you have to step back from the final operation and look at the arc of the man himself. Reuters reported that Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born in 1966 in Michoacán, in a region long shaped by poverty, migration, agriculture, and criminal influence. He later went north to the United States, where he was arrested on drug charges, served time, and was eventually deported back to Mexico in the 1990s. But those details are not just background. They are the early coordinates of a trajectory that would eventually make him one of the most hunted men in the world. The return to Mexico did not place him at the margins of criminal power. It placed him inside a country whose cartel landscape was shifting, fragmenting, and opening new space for leaders who could combine violence with structure. He has been described in reporting as someone who rose, not because he inherited an old dynasty, but because he proved operationally effective inside a changing underworld. That distinction is important. His power was not built only on name recognition. It was built on the ability to command networks, protect routes, enforce discipline, and survive wave after wave of state pressure. But from that rise came the cartel that would define his legacy. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. Reuters and U.S. government sources have described CJNG as a transnational criminal organization with deep involvement in trafficking methamphetamine, fentanyl, cocaine, and other drugs. Over time, it became associated not only with expansion, but with a style of aggression that drew intense state attention. This was not a small local organization operating quietly below the national radar. CJNG became one of the most powerful criminal structures in Mexico, with influence extending across numerous states and across international trafficking corridors. What made that growth especially significant was that it happened during a period when cartel power in Mexico was fragmenting and being reassembled. That environment rewarded organizations that could move quickly, seize territory, build supply chains, and confront rivals and the state with speed. By the time Mencho's name was widely known internationally, he was no longer just a fugitive leader. He had become the central figure in a cartel the United States and Mexico both regarded as a top-level threat. One of the moments that helped cement that reputation came in 2015. That year, during a major Mexican operation targeting CJNG, a military helicopter was shot down. Reuters and the U.S. Department of Justice treat that incident as a defining escalation in the conflict between the Mexican state and the cartel. The symbolism of it was enormous. A military aircraft represents not only force, but surveillance, reach, and federal authority. When one is brought down in the context of an anti-cartel operation, the message lands far beyond the battlefield itself. It tells the public that a criminal organization is willing to confront the state in spectacular fashion. It tells institutions that the cartel is not merely hiding from pressure, but pushing back against it. And it tells rivals, local communities, and the international press that a new level of power has arrived. The 2015 helicopter incident became one of the reasons Mencho was no longer seen simply as another cartel boss. He became a symbol of escalation, a name tied to a phase of organized crime in Mexico defined by operational boldness, territorial ambition, and a refusal to stay invisible. Years passed, and still he remained at large. That long survival added to the mystique around him, but it also reveals something practical. Staying free that long under the combined pressure of the Mexican military, intelligence units, prosecutors, sanctions, and U.S. agencies usually means a target has built multiple layers of protection. Movement becomes unpredictable. Communications narrow. Safe houses multiply. Trusted intermediaries become filters. Entire routines are designed to reduce exposure. That is why the eventual breakthrough matters so much. It suggests that after all the layers of security, all the geographic advantages, all the years of evasion, the pressure points were no longer primarily logistical. They were personal, and that fits a broader truth in long manhunts. The outer shell often looks impossible to penetrate until a small point of contact on the inside becomes the opening. So if authorities had in fact been monitoring a trusted associate tied to a romantic partner, then they were not just watching a target. They were mapping a social world, waiting for the moment when human behavior became more revealing than any fortress ever could be. By late 2024 and early 2025, the pressure around the organization had already grown more intense. The U.S. Department of State increased the reward for information leading to Mencho's arrest or conviction to up to $15 million. That number is not merely symbolic. It signals priority, expands the pool of potential informants, and keeps a case at the center of cross-border law enforcement attention. Then came another major blow in March 2025, when his son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, he was sentenced in Washington to life in prison plus 30 years. The Department of Justice said He was ordered to forfeit more than $6 billion in drug trafficking proceeds. That sentence mattered for several reasons at once. It was a legal strike against the family core. It underscored how deeply U.S. prosecutors had penetrated the case against the organization. And it removed a figure who had been described as one of the cartel's most important leaders. Even if El Mencho himself remained free, the inner circle around him was being squeezed. In stories like this, the final raid often gets the headline, but the raid usually lands after years of quieter damage has already weakened the structure around the main target. Then came February 2026. Reporting from Reuters and AP says Mexican forces moved on a property near Tapalpa, Jalisco, after intelligence narrowed in on his location. Tapalpa is not an accidental setting in this story. Mountain terrain and wooded areas can offer concealment, distance from major urban scrutiny, and strategic control over movement. For someone who had survived this long, a place like that fits the pattern of careful seclusion rather than reckless visibility. But even seclusion can become a trap if surveillance has already done its work. According to the reporting, the operation involved Mexican armed forces, and Reuters said it was supported by U.S. intelligence assistance. During the operation, Oseguera was fatally injured. With that, one of the most pursued cartel leaders in the hemisphere was dead. Yet the operation did not close the story. It detonated it. Because the hour after a leader falls is often the moment when the system under him begins showing what it is still capable of doing without him. That aftermath is one of the most important parts of this case. AP reported extensive road blockades and burning vehicles across multiple regions after El Mencho's death. Reuters described retaliatory violence, arson, disruption, and a rapid security response. This was not random background noise after a major raid. It was a signal. It said that even if the figure at the top had been removed, the organization beneath him still had the capacity to interfere with daily life, Project Fear, and turn one event into a much wider crisis. This is the logic of cartel retaliation. A blockade does more than stop traffic. It demonstrates reach. It tells civilians that the state may win a headline, but the cartel can still interrupt the ordinary rhythm of life. It tells officials that a tactical victory can trigger strategic fallout. It tells rivals that the network remains reactive. And it tells the world that removing one man does not instantly dissolve the machinery he commanded. If anything, the immediate chaos after the raid made clear that the death of El Mencho was not a clean ending. It was a destabilizing shock to a structure powerful enough to produce consequences in real time. Somewhere in the middle of this story, that is the point worth holding on to, and if you value this kind of carefully built, fact-based storytelling, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Dre, because cases like this are never just about one man. They are about the systems he leaves behind. But there is another reason the aftermath mattered so much. This was not an isolated local event. Jalisco is one of Mexico's most economically important states, and Guadalajara, its capital, is one of the country's most significant cities. When unrest spread after the raid, the concern moved beyond local security and into national stability, commerce, travel, and international attention. Reuters reported that the violence disrupted movement and drew high-level public messaging. AP reported that civilians sheltered as the scale of the disruptions became visible. The response from the Mexican government was to urge calm and project control. But calm is never just a mood in situations like this. It is an objective. The public message matters because cartel power is not only measured in weapons or routes, and it is measured in how successfully it can alter the emotional environment around a major event. Fear is part of the strategy. Uncertainty is part of the strategy. The state, in turn, has to fight on two fronts at once: the operational front on the ground and the psychological front in public perception. That is why this story captured such broad attention. It was not simply about the death of a wanted fugitive. It was about a test of whether the state could absorb the blowback that came with taking him off the board. And that brings us to the central mystery that gives this story its staying power. How does a man survive for so long under this level of pressure and then suddenly become reachable? The answer does not appear to be sudden at all. It appears to be cumulative. Years of international scrutiny, a pressure on relatives and lieutenants, sanctions, indictments, reward offers, intelligence work, surveillance, patience. Every one of those things matters on its own, but they matter even more in combination. A criminal leader can survive one setback, even several. What becomes harder to survive is a decade of compounding pressure that reduces room for movement, room for trust, room for error. The case against El Mencho seems to have moved in precisely that direction. It did not build toward one dramatic reveal so much as narrow toward one final location. And once that location was fixed, the long era of his evasion ended not in a courtroom or a surrender, but in a military operation that carried immediate national consequences. This is one reason the story feels bigger than the final raid itself. It is the climax of a long campaign whose most decisive phase may have unfolded quietly, away from cameras, through intelligence and human mapping rather than spectacle. There is also a deeper lesson here about organized crime leadership. Public imagination often treats cartel bosses as nearly mythic figures, protected by endless wealth, loyal enforcers, remote geography, and the fear they inspire. But stories like this expose the tension between myth and reality. Yes, such figures can build remarkable layers of insulation. Yes, they can evade capture for years. Yes, they can command organizations that shape entire regions. But power at that level also creates isolation, pressure, and dependence. The higher a leader climbs, the more he must trust a shrinking circle. The more security-conscious he becomes, the more vulnerable he may become to small breaches within that circle. The more he vanishes from public view, the more the personal connections that remain begin to matter. That does not romanticize the figure. It demystifies him. It shows that even inside a criminal empire built on fear, the final weakness can be as ordinary as a relationship, a familiar route, or a trusted go-between whose movements become visible to the wrong eyes. In that sense, the reported lead through a romantic partner's circle is not a minor detail. It is the key that changes the entire emotional shape of the case. It brings the story down from legend to human scale, and that is where the real tension lives. After a leader like this is removed, the next question is usually the most difficult one. What happens to the organization now? The history offers more than one answer. Sometimes a cartel consolidates under another trusted figure and keeps functioning with surprising continuity. Sometimes a power vacuum opens, rivalries surface, and fragmentation produces even more violence. Reuters reported after the raid that despite El Mencho's death, the cartel's deep operational networks, including activity linked to the United States, were expected to endure. That point is critical. Leadership removal is dramatic, but criminal infrastructure does not disappear overnight. Supply routes, money flows, local alliances, corrupt protection, distribution channels, and financial mechanisms can survive the loss of one leader, especially when the structure has been built to operate in layers. At the same time, the removal of both a long-standing leader and, earlier, a major family successor figure creates uncertainty at the top. And uncertainty at the top often produces consequences far below, in cities, towns, routes, and neighborhoods where communities pay the price of instability. So when people ask whether this raid ended something, the honest answer is only partly. It ended one chapter. It did not end the structure. That is what makes the title of this story so charged. A military operation took out one of the most feared cartel leaders in Mexico. Americans in affected areas were warned to shelter. The country watched roads burn. The world watched a cartel respond in real time. But behind the shock value is a more enduring narrative. The story of a man who emerged from a poor region in Michoacán, crossed into the United States, was arrested, deported, returned. He rose inside the shifting cartel landscape of Mexico, helped build CJNG into a dominant criminal organization, survived one of the most intense long-term manhunts in the hemisphere, saw the pressure close around his inner circle, and was finally tracked through the very kind of human connection that large criminal systems can never fully eliminate. It is a story about power, but not just power. It is about the architecture of survival. It is about the difference between seeming unreachable and actually being unreachable. And it is about what happens when the illusion of permanence around a criminal leader is broken in public view. Because once that illusion breaks, everyone starts asking the same question. If he could be found after all those years, who is exposed next? There is one more point worth making before this story closes. On cases like this can easily be told in a way that mistakes noise for understanding. The headlines focus on the raid. The images focus on the aftermath. The names focus on fear. But the real shape of the case comes from the timeline. A birth in 1966 in Michoacán, migration north. A U.S. drug arrest and deportation in the 1990s. A return to a changing criminal landscape. The rise of CJNG. The 2015 helicopter shoot-down that signaled a new scale of confrontation. The years of fugitive status. The reward climbing to $15 million. The 2025 sentence imposed on his son in the United States. The patient intelligence work. The narrowing surveillance. The operation near Tapalpa on February 22, 2026. And then, the immediate retaliation that proved how much of the organization still remained active after the man at the top was gone. When you line those pieces up, the story becomes more than a sensational headline. It becomes a case study in how cartel power is built, how the state pursues it, and how difficult it is to end an organization simply by removing its most visible leader. That is the real significance of El Mencho's death. Not only that it happened, but what it revealed about the structure around him. So here is where the story stands. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes is dead. The operation that ended his life appears to have come after intelligence traced a path through personal connections that finally led authorities to him. The aftermath showed that CJNG was still able to trigger widespread disruption even after losing its central leader. U.S. and Mexican authorities had been tightening pressure for years. And the sentence against his son in 2025 was one of the clearest signs that the circle around him was already under strain. What comes next will not be decided by one raid, one statement, or 1 week of headlines. It will be decided by whether the organization consolidates, fractures, or mutates under continued pressure. It will be decided by how much of its financial and logistical structure can survive leadership loss. It will be decided in the months and years ahead, not in the first rush of breaking news. But one thing is already clear. On February 22, 2026, a chapter in cartel history ended in the mountains near Tapalpa, and the vacuum left behind did not arrive quietly. If you want more deeply researched, fact-driven crime stories told with clarity and tension, subscribe now to True Crime Dre, like this video, and stay with the channel because the story of El Mencho may have reached its ending, but the story of the structure he built is still unfolding.